Hello and welcome to the Zanga African Metrics webinar. We are excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining. We'll be getting started in the next 2 minutes. We are just giving a bit of chance for more people to join us, and we'll be getting started soon. I want to welcome you all to this webinar. We are very excited to have you. We have a wonderful topic for you today, and we are so grateful that you are here. I can see some familiar names, Stephanie, David. Thank you so much for joining and coming to this webinar today. Just to let you know, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will be answering any and all questions at the end of this webinar. And we will be getting started just now. We'll give it another minute just to let one or two other colleagues come through. And I'd like to take this chance to welcome all our participants here on Zoom, to welcome all our viewers on LinkedIn, and those who will watch it later on our YouTube channel. We do have a YouTube channel. Please like, follow, and subscribe, and hit the notification button. Every webinar we host will be shared there after the day. So, exciting news, and we will get started in a minute. Thank you. All right, it's time to get started. I am excited. Let me introduce myself. My name is Amadeus Musumali. I'm the head of marketing here at Zanga African Metrics. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. On this call with me is my co-host and my colleague, Doreen Malavanu, who is also a business psychologist. Welcome, Doreen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amadeus. I'm excited.
Fantastic. As we get started, just some small housekeeping guidelines on our side. We welcome any and all questions. As I said, please put them in the chat, and we will get to them during the Q&A session. We love the interaction with you, our community, and we are excited about it today. If you can, please turn your camera on and your microphone off. It's a pleasure to see you and to see the face behind the name. And again, any questions, please do put them in the chat box. We will gather them and we will get to them. I will add one more thing to this, and this is we have an evaluation form for this webinar. Give us feedback. We want to hear from you. So towards the end of this webinar, please do fill out the evaluation form. Give us some feedback. Help us make these webinars better for people like you. With that being said, let me introduce my co-host, who you have already met, Doreen. Doreen is our research and development lead. She is a business psychologist. She is an amazing person, and I'm very excited to have her here today to share a little bit about the topic. If you've never been on one of our webinars before, we are Zanga African Metrics. We are an HR tech company that supports leadership development with assessments and analytics for the leadership in high context cultures of the global South. We're excited to be here. We believe in supporting you as HR practitioners, as leaders, as coaches who are building leaders that are transforming our continent. With that being said, Doreen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amadeus, for that introduction. And like I said earlier, I'm very excited to be yet again hosting another webinar for the public, and I would like to thank everyone who has joined us today and who will join later on YouTube and on other platforms, maybe LinkedIn. And so, as introduced, as advertised, I want to take the time of this webinar today to talk about leadership behavior, psychological safety, and workplace culture. If you have been within this space, I mean HR, psychometrics, work psychology, surely none of these topics are new. But I think it's very useful to look at them together in conjunction and see how they depend on each other, but also see how then what solutions we're bringing to the workplace. Because one thing that we're keen to do in this space is to offer practical tips, so that we don't just give awareness about what could be happening, but we also tell you, so then what can you do about it in your space, so in your role, be it HR, be it a coach, be it a leader in an organization, an employee, whatever it is that you're doing, we hope that you can find a practical tip to take away from the session. And so just to summarize what we'll be going over, what we're covering today in this presentation, I will be discussing psychological safety and specifically defining it and using a few scenarios to draw out, especially how it looks like in practice or in organizations. But like I said, also I'll be looking at the link and seeing and discussing how leadership behavior, psychological safety, and workplace culture link together or are connected, and how they influence each other and what it means for organizations as a whole. But I also will have a few practical tips for improving psychological safety in the workplace before we discuss some takeaways and allow you guys to now address some of your questions that you will have asked. And as Amadeus shared, please do not feel shy. Pop your questions in the chat. You can even pop it privately to me or to Amadeus. And at the Q&A session at the end, we'll address that for you. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So, like I said, I wanted to use a few scenarios and especially bring out to what we mean so that it's not just theoretical, but it also triggers you to think a little bit about your own situation currently or what you have experienced and think about how what we're discussing relates to that. And so when we talk about workplace culture, we understand culture even outside of work. It includes the norms and the values and the beliefs that people share and how it shapes then how people live. And in the workplace, it's the same thing. It just shapes how people work. So this could be what is normal in terms of communication. Do you something as simple as do you get in the office and greet everybody, or is it more like everybody gets in and they get to work? How do you handle conflict? Or it could be as things a bit more serious, like how you handle conflict, and how do you handle change? And so, just so that we can understand this a bit more better, I want us to reflect on these three questions that I have on the screen. And let's get some insight and reflect on our own culture in the workplaces that we work. So I'd like for you to think about what behaviors get rewarded and recognized in the organization. So maybe you have a formal appraisal system, and what usually comes up as things that stand out about people in these appraisal systems. So on a more maybe on a more informal way, what do leaders recognize openly? What do managers recognize that they appreciate and they see as valuable in people? Is it people who work hard? So is it hard work and performance? Is it people who help others? So is it like a collaboration that gets rewarded and recognized? Is it people who I don't know, maybe they go out of their way to have a positive influence on others in the organization? So just think of that. Think of what gets rewarded, what gets leaders' attentions, and what have they appreciated in the past about employees. But also think about feedback. So usually usually feedback is one of those key things that helps us improve. So when somebody has done something good, or maybe not even so good, what how do they get feedback? Is it a one-on-one conversation that the leader pulls them into and tells them, I'd like to discuss your performance? Is it a more of a system where it'll be out in public with the whole team listening in and hearing about the mistakes that you've done? And is it a formal, organized exercise, or is it more informal, as in maybe it's a text message, maybe it's something you get at the end of the workday when you've gotten home and somebody's texting you to say, I didn't like what you did today. So think about that. But also think about, this has been any major changes. How has that been handled? Has it been, have there been efforts, for example, to bring everybody together to discuss solutions or to discuss what's changing, to discuss what's going to remain the same and what it means? Has it been more of people being kept maybe a bit in the dark, or only certain people knowing about what's happening? What do these things, and what do these things say about your organization? You can share it if you'd like to, but if you don't, that's fine. And these are just things that I wanted us to reflect on as we go into this conversation, because they are some indicators of what the culture, what the norms, what the values are in the organization. It's very easy to have a value statement, a mission statement. But what can really tell us what is being valued is the day-to-day activities, what gets rewarded, how feedback is given, how communications are done, how decisions are made. This is what will give us real insight about the culture in the workplace. So now we move on to psychological safety. And of course, later I'm going to link all of these and see where the connection is. So this has been a topic of great interest to a lot of people. There's been a lot of conversation online, at least on my algorithm, because we know those are catered to each person. So it's been a heavy topic, and there's been a lot of conversation about psychological safety. And so just to clarify what we mean by psychological safety is that the shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And there's been a lot of research about this concept of psychological safety and what it means and what it implies for organizations. And so just to help us understand this in practice again, there's some scenarios here. So first of all, to clarify what we mean by interpersonal risk taking, it could be things like admitting that you've made a mistake, pointing out when somebody else has made, or you think that they're making a mistake. So the reason why this is risky is there is a perception that is tied to that action. And so what is the perception of the team, of your manager, of the organization to people speaking about these things? So speaking it, what is the perception tied to somebody saying, I've made a mistake? What is the perception tied to somebody saying, I think if we do this, then we might not get the results that we're aiming for? And so that will give you some insight about, that was just to clarify what we mean by the interpersonal risk taking in the organization. And so some scenarios here to just, again, demonstrate psychological safety in practice is, if, for example, a nurse is working with a patient and they notice that the dose that they've been prescribed is over the recommended level. What do you think would occur? So, according to what, just personally, what do you think would occur and what do you think should occur? So, within, should this nurse call a doctor? Whether this is correct. So whether what the doctor has said, the doctor who is an authority figure and also the supervisor in that role, whether that is correct. And do you think that is the likely action that would be taken? Similarly to a junior pilot suspecting that a main pilot is making a deadly mistake. What do you think in this situation will occur? Do you think they will speak up and point out the mistake, especially given the implication that it could lead to deadly um, results, or do you think they will give them more time and say maybe they'll just figure it out? I mean, they're one with more experience here. And similarly, where there isn't perhaps the what we were trying to identify to demonstrate with the superiority issue is a new executive joining a successful company, but having reservations about some of their strategies. What do you think should happen? Should they talk it out? Should they point out that they have some reservations and reasons why? Or should they go with the flow because this company is successful and surely there's a reason for it being successful? And so I think with these scenarios, you're seeing the demonstration that we're trying to make with there being that is obvious but should be taken for the benefit of maybe it's the company, maybe it's the clients or the customers. And then there's an inner kind of like dilemma of a person. What will they do? What are they actually going to do? And so in a psychologically safe environment, what is likely to occur is that this person is able and is actually encouraged to speak out their concerns, their mistakes, and whatever it is that could be bothering them at the time. And the reason why we might not be very open to speak to it, and this is just one of the reasons. It's not the only reasons. Is that certain actions that we make, like I said previously, there are perceptions that are tied to the actions that we make and to what we do, especially when you're saying something like I've made a mistake. So we do not want to appear as ignorant, of course, that we don't know, as incompetent, that we can't do our jobs well, that as intrusive, that we want to upset whatever has been the flow or whatever has been the norm of action in the organization, even straight out negative, that we are going against what people have agreed on and think is positive and think would work. And we don't want to be that chaos agent that will say, actually, we don't think this will work. And actually, we have some reservations. And so well, usually people respond to this because they want to maintain that perception of being of looking competent, of being positive and being taken as a team player or a great collaborator is that they wouldn't ask questions. They don't admit to weaknesses. They don't listen to the ideas and they don't critique whatever status quo that they find. But this is what then characterizes a psychologically unsafe workplace culture or workplace norm. Is that when people don't ask questions, when people can't admit to weaknesses, and they don't have ideas or critique the status quo, that indicates that it's not psychologically safe. But the perceptions that are tied to having or expressing these actions are very risky, as in maybe they have some implications on the person's job, on the person's reputation, on the organization, and much more that could affect themselves or their career. And so, what this means, or what this leads to in terms of organizations, they eventually become unable to innovate because we understand with innovation, there has to be some new ideas. There has to be people who are coming up and saying, I actually see an opportunity here to do something differently because what we have been doing hasn't been working. And maybe when they're able to communicate that with the manager, with their colleagues, their coworkers, and that is not taken as a threat. It's not taken as challenging or upsetting things where there isn't a need to fix things, then companies are able to innovate. And we're seeing very rapidly how we are being forced in some ways to innovate by technological advances, by changes in a lot of things like funding and all of that is happening around the world. We're being forced to come up with new ideas, to come up with new strategies. And if people can't openly discuss or openly express what they think, then there isn't really that space to grow and to innovate and to think of new ideas and strategies. But also it leads to a lot of increased energy when we are not able to ask questions, when employees can't admit to weaknesses and offer up ideas. There's a lot of anxious energy that is within a team. And so this actually comes in together with when leaders don't foster this environment, yet they have very high expectations of people and they demand people perform to an excellent level, but they don't give space or they don't encourage questions and discussions and openly admitting to mistakes, then it just brings a lot of anxiety. A lot of people are then anxious about having to perform, but at the same time, not making mistakes as they struggle to perform to the level that they have to as employees. But also, it's very clear then that their performance is going to go down because if you can't discuss areas that you're struggling, then you can't improve. It's very hard then to improve. It's very hard to get support from people who maybe understand the topic in area better. And leaders, there's something they can do about this. There's something they have a great influence on the team, on the workplace culture, on how people perceive the norms of a team and of an organization. And there's many things that they can do. And some of these I discuss in the next slide. Right. So as leaders, the more inclusive we are, the more transparent we are with the decisions that we're making, with things that are going on with the organization, and more supportive that we are, of course, of the people that we lead. These are actions that actively build psychological safety, which, as we discussed previously, will then have implications to how people perform and how organizations are able to innovate. So when they just demand excellence and they hold people accountable, but do not create these environments for people to discuss their mistakes or concerns, that is when the anxious teams arise, whereby there's high expectations, but there isn't a matching level of support or understanding that enables you to perform. And what leaders can do in this sense and in these scenarios is to learn to frame work in general as a learning problem and not an execution problem. So then it's not an issue of people having not done something right or having to reach um, a certain impossible standard, but rather you look at the work itself as something that has a bit of uncertainty. And what that uncertainty will need is for people to openly discuss and people to openly voice out concerns and what they're learning in the process so that they can together solve the problem. So it's a learning problem. It's a problem that we are tackling as a team as we move forward. And it's not just that they want results from these people. And this is not to say that the accountability and the excellence should be then put aside. That is not the case here, but rather we're reframing how we achieve that excellence, how we achieve that accountability as a team. But also leaders can learn to acknowledge their own fallibility. We're not perfect, we don't know everything. And so even in simple terms, it doesn't have to be some major show of acknowledging and sharing all of your weaknesses, but rather simple terms and things like saying, I might be missing something here, or maybe I'm not the best person or I'm not the biggest expert in this. And so what this creates, because as leaders, we're models for other people, and they see how we behave as the norm, as the model, as the inspiration for them people should behave in that workplace and what is acceptable. Then people can learn to also acknowledge and tell their own weaknesses and discuss it openly with other employees in the workplace. And also, as leaders, we can model curiosity. So learn to ask questions openly, even in teams, even when something is not understandable, instead of having this perhaps high and mighty position that we take, that we think that, or we strive to show that we know everything and nothing can go wrong. So these are some of the few ways that leaders can learn, that leaders can do in order to improve psychological safety in organizations. So a major concern that can come up, and I have been hinting at this previously, is that leaders can have this concern that employees will take advantage and not perform well. If I learn to accept people's mistakes, if I learn to say it's okay to make mistakes and we're learning from them, then maybe we think that we're giving them a lot of leeway to make even more mistakes. But actually, research suggests differently. And there is 4 zones that we can end up in based on given the amount of psychological safety, that is the openness to learning as a team and openness to so not punishing interpersonal risks such as speaking up, but also the level of motivation and accountability that leaders hold people to. We could end up in 4 different zones. And so the lower left zone is the empathy zone, where with low motivation, low accountability, but also low psychological safety, that is just indifference. You just result in a culture of indifference. That is, people show up to work. They are not encouraged to speak up. They're not encouraged to voice out their concerns. Neither do they get acknowledged or discussed in the open. And also, they're not very motivated to do work. So that is not the most effective of organizations. And frankly, I don't think they'll be able to reach any of their goals if that is the zone that is the zone and the culture that the employees and the leaders exist in. But as hinted on previously, with the lower right zone, now here we end up in with high motivation and accountability, but low psychological safety. Then this breeds a lot of anxiety in employees, whereby you understand that the expectations are really high, but you also are not given the flexibility to address any of your concerns, to voice out when you've made some mistakes, to discuss new strategies, to discuss your new ideas of how you can adapt, innovate, change things with the team, with your managers. And so there's anxiety related there to performing at an extraordinary level while not having that important risk of having the ability to speak out, but also offer feedback, but also get feedback yourself about your performance and other key insight to your performance. Right? But also with the higher left zone, that's the comfort zone. And that is perhaps what leaders are a bit scared of or a bit skeptical of when it comes to implementing strategies to increase or enhance psychological safety, is that people will not become comfortable. You'll make a mistake, you'll admit the mistake, you'll say, oh, that's fine. We all learn from mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes myself. And they get comfortable and they know that they can make the mistake and it will be taken as a norm. And that could lead to, yes, of course, it's a comfortable workforce, comfortable employees. But you could end up leaving a lot of money on the table if you're working to if it's a for profit that you're working impact, if it's not for profit. Because then mistakes are taken as a norm, but people are not being held accountable or to a high standard. But maybe a certain, just past a certain level, you shouldn't be making the same type of mistakes that you've made. And you're held accountable to learning and moving beyond that level of mistakes. But of course, the higher right zone is the learning zone. It's also the most high performance zone, where people are both motivated, held accountable, but also faced with or they have the culture of having a high psychological safety, whereby they encourage to speak about their concerns. They encourage to share when they've made mistakes, but also as a team, as an individual, and also as a team, have people learn from that mistake. The thing is, if we're working, say, in the same line of work, it's very likely that a mistake that I've made will be made by somebody else, perhaps in a similar role. And if I'm able to speak out and share with the team and say, I've made this mistake, then another person goes learn from it. And so it's not just me who is growing from making that mistake, it's also wisdom offered to the team, it's also growth offered to the team in general. And so the idea that with high psychological safety, people will become comfortable, mistakes will become the norm. That is not what we are aiming for with all this talk about psychological safety. We are aiming for the learning zone, which is the high performance zone, where people openly speak, learn, innovate, move on to the next step. So if anything, they should be making new mistakes, but not old ones. Right. So what does this mean for key for tools such as psychometric tools? Like Amadeus include as he said in the beginning, we design psychometric tools for high context cultures. And some of the tools that we have in our suite include the individual competency assessment, 360 assessment, but also engagement surveys. So when it comes to deploying these tools in an organization, the level of psychological safety that people have can affect the value and utility of these psychometric tools. And what we mean by that is if it's frowned upon, if it's seen as ignorant and competent for me to make mistakes or for me to look like I don't know something, then it's likely that I won't say the truth when it comes to admitting to issues that I see in the organization because I want to be perceived as competent. Then I might not rate myself when it comes to rating my own behaviors, or even other people's behaviors, because then I want to protect them. Um, as I think they really are, but I rate them favorably because I want everybody to seem is a good person. I do not want to put the people at risk. And this is actually a bigger concern for high context cultures because usually, or the norm is that there is a value of community, that we value other people and we value um, how we put their interests as well at the same level, or in some cases even above. And so we don't want them to seem incompetent. So if I'm rating my manager, I will not say that they're incompetent. I will say actually they're perfect. And so this then leads to a lot of false information and false insight that may make it seem like an organization or team is performing to a certain level, which it isn't. And you might then end up asking yourself, like, why are we getting such good insight? We're getting what we have done, or from the studies, from the psychometric tools we've deployed, we get the feeling that this team is highly effective, but in practice, it's not able to perform to the level that it is expected to, given the level of effectiveness. And it's just because the mistakes are not being communicated openly. The voices of people remain inside. They can't actually talk about it in ways that can bring these issues to the surface in a way that can be dealt with. And so it is, and this is one example of for strategy that might not work as well in environments where there's low psychological safety. But there's so many others. There is so many others to choose from. Psychological safety can undermine the effectiveness of organizations. Right. So that was my short discussion about leadership behavior, psychological safety, and workplace culture. And there's some three key takeaways that I'd like to highlight for us to take away with us as we go away from this conversation. Is that one, psychological safety is very essential to performance. When people are able to make interpersonal risks that can make them seem incompetent, that can make them seem ignorant, that can make them seem like they don't know what they're doing. This is encouraging such risks and encouraging such behavior will enable teams, individuals, but also teams, to be able to learn, to innovate, and to perform even better. And this is, of course, the opposite of this is then leaning towards silence, as in not speaking up when there's concerns, tendency to protect yourself, and so even speaking or not giving feedback when prompted to, and blaming other people because you don't want to be accountable for the mistakes that you've made. But also another key takeaway is that leaders have a very high influence on creating these cultures of psychological safety, and that when they're more inclusive, when they're more transparent, and when they're more supportive, then people can feel more open more open to sharing when they have concerns, when they make mistakes, and when they have other issues that are key for the leaders to understand, but also for the team in general. And that psychological safety affects the utility of people, but also key strategies. The norms, the values, and the beliefs that what happens when concerns and mistakes are revealed. These influence how people respond to psychometric tools and lead to inaccurate perceptions about teams, about organizations, and their effectiveness. And so this marks the end of my presentation today. I'd like to welcome any questions. Like I shared previously, you can pop them in the chat. You can address them to Amadeus or myself, and we will address them here directly. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Julian. That was amazing. I definitely learned something. I love the learning zone and the graphic you shared with us. And I see
Right.
that there are some questions being posted and some questions have been shared with me already. Just
Okay.
a reminder to every participant, please give us feedback on this webinar. We will be answering your questions now, but we really appreciate if you just took a minute or two just to give us some honest feedback so we can make these webinars better for you and other participants like you. With that said, the floor is open. What I will do is I will allow participants to unmute themselves, but we will start off with one of the questions that has already been posted. And thank you so much. Anybody with a question, please put your hand up so that we don't miss you. And here is a question from Stephanie. I would like to know the
Right.
cultural dimensions of the Zanga African metrics in how the cultural dimension of the Zanga African metrics assessment influence psychological safety. Very good question. How do they do
That
that?
is a very good question, Stephanie, and thank you. And so, and I think it's very relevant to our discussion because as an organization that creates tools for high context cultures, we then have to address the values that come with high context cultures and how they could influence these constructs like psychological safety that we're discussing. And so the Zanga cultural dimensions, including community, including power, loyalty, belief, and etc. These are definitely very influential in determining the psychological safety of organizations. And I'd like to highlight one, which is power. And so with high context cultures, there is a value or a cultural norm of having a high power distance that is between leaders and between non-leaders, since we're talking in a leadership context. Between non-leaders, there's really a power differential, and that is associated with actions such as being unable to question a leader, for example, with it just being frowned upon or not very encouraged or not seeming as the norm to question a leader. So you accept their actions, you accept whatever that they share, but also not only being able to question, but also being unable to criticize or even sometimes openly raise concerns to your leaders. And I think when the same culture is brought to organizations, as is the case often, that the culture of maybe a country or of a wider context is reflected in the organization, then it's definitely makes it very conducive to have a low psychological safety in the organization. and what leaders need to understand. And that is why in our leadership model, we talk about leader cultural intelligence. So a leader understanding what cultural dynamics are in play here and how are they handling that in order to perform the outcomes or the objectives of their role. And so as leaders, they have to be very aware when somebody is silent in a meeting, when people have been asked to share their opinions and everybody is silent, it doesn't necessarily imply that they agree. And making space, for example, for things like one-on-one catch-up meetings where people or leaders are able to more openly probe people's opinions could bring out people's opinions and people's concerns. And so it's very likely that the these cultural values that go on outside, that is in high context cultures, are reflected in the organizations, and they could breed a low psychological safety environment. But as leaders, we have to understand what is happening in certain key moments, like you mentioned, in the meetings, sometimes even in one-on-one conversations, and be willing to adjust so that we can achieve what we're trying to with that exercise. I hope
Excellent.
I've
Very
given
good
some
question.
insight onto your question, Stephanie. Yeah, great question.
Great question indeed. Mr. Young
Yeah.
Miller, please, you're free to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and webinar.
Yeah.
So hopefully I can be heard here. So thanks for the webinar. I have a question as a leader, as a manager. How can you? You mentioned a couple of things already, but what are practical things that you can do to improve the psychological safety of your team members? If you notice that maybe some of them, like you mentioned, not speaking up or are quiet, what can you practical things that you can do yourself as a leader to improve that feeling within the team? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that that's a great question. And yes, I have offered a few strategies or tips. But I think as leaders, like I said, we have a lot of influence on the work culture, on what people perceive to be the norm. And so sometimes it will take a little bit of self-reflection. It's reflecting on your behavior and how these actions may be perceived by people, by people who report to you, for example. And so if, for example, you notice that you can be a bit direct and to the point, and people then take that as you being authoritarian, but maybe that's a perception you'd have to reflect and maybe ask a few people. Then you see then it could mean that people feel unsafe and feel like there's no space to challenge what you're saying or your opinions, but also implementing. So if you're seeing, like you mentioned, if you're seeing that people are not being very open and they're not sharing what they feel or what their concerns are, I think starting with one-on-one catch-up sessions would be useful, because then there is the removed group and the dynamics that come with a group, because social psychology actually dictates that we act very differently in the presence of other people, and our perceptions are very different when we're how we are perceived and how we are managing our perceptions are very different when we're individuals and when we're with a group of people. And so this is seen in things like when there's a group of people and you haven't understood maybe a strategy that is being discussed or something that a leader is saying, and you haven't understood it, and nobody else is asking questions about it, and you don't want to seem stupid, so you'll just keep quiet and you won't raise any concerns. But this could be different in a one-on-one situation where a leader is more open and actually employs some of the strategies that I discussed earlier. So they can even be a bit vulnerable and say, I perhaps don't know. I'm not the best. I'm not the expert in this, and I feel like your opinion could help me here. What do you think of this? And that could actually be an avenue for this person to open up and say what they really think. And so, like I said, to just reiterate, I think it takes a little bit of self-reflection. So reflect on your own actions, reflect on how you communicate and how people react to this. and reflect on perhaps instances where people have reacted differently to you communicating with them in a group versus you communicating with them as individuals. And what does that tell you then? Does that mean you have to take more people apart and discuss maybe in smaller groups or as individuals, and just adjust your approach from there? So it takes a little bit of trial and error, but being able and being adaptable with your approach is what will help you then reach the right balance of helping people feel psychologically safe, but also holding them accountable. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Doreen. Another very good question. And Simba Rasha has another very good question.
Yeah.
What's been your experience, if any, working with the public sector on psychological safety and learning cultures? Very good question. How does this?
Can you say that again?
What has been your experience, if any,
Yeah.
working with
Yeah.
the public sector on psychological safety and learning cultures? So what has been our experience with the issue of psychological safety and creating
Yeah.
learning zone in the public
Thank
sector?
you. In the public sector. Thank you. I feel like that's a very specific question. And from my own experience, unfortunately, I haven't worked with the public sector, but I have interacted with some leadership consultants who work with people in the public sector, and they seem to be of the opinion that the cultural dimensions that we were discussing are very highly reflected in the public sector. But I also see that Nankondi has raised her hand, and I think she might have some better insight onto this. So I'll let her take the floor.
Thank you, Doreen, and very interesting question. I think at Zanga African Metrics, we've had some experience working with the public sector over the last few years. In fact, this year, the Zambia Public Service Change Management Framework that was launched by the Secretary to the Cabinet for the entire public service was developed by us. And in order to introduce a structured framework for managing change, both the process of introducing reforms and then the actual behavioral change that is required to understand the new behaviors that will make it successful, was something that we spent the last few years developing. And as such, we had to work with a high-level steering committee of permanent secretaries, PSs, a technical working group of directors, and other officers. And I think working with the public service is interesting in that it has its own almost norms and practices that come from both the culture, national and tradition, but also from the organizational structures that come with being a formal organization, and the organizational values that go with it. So you've got the coexistence. And I think this is where Doreen was talking about cultural and contextual mastery in leadership development. It's that ability to understand and walk into a room and understand what are the dynamics and what are the sources of what you're experiencing in the room as a leader. And so when working in the public service, we were able to understand from the first meeting, what are the dynamics here? So there is power distance, there's hierarchical structures, and this is set in the working practices. But then on top of it, there's cultural dynamics that then speak to how gender and age and the space is enabled to allow everybody to contribute. And so I think you become more conscious when working with the public sector of picking up what's going on. Now, this is normal for a leader in any sector, private or public. But in the public sector, when you apply it, you start to see what are the layers of this system that are providing information to me to understand what are the norms and practices, informal and informal, what are the boundaries, and how are the relationships? And that then guides to understand the dynamic of the public sector. The relationships are managed differently. the sources of this come from the structure of being a public service, but also from the culture of hierarchy. And so I would say working with the public service is a bit more sensitive because it's more formal in the way it operates, and that's similar to different types of organizational systems. But in the context of high context cultures and Zambia or Africa, for example, there's the added layer of understanding when you walk into the room, what systems are you walking into? Because there is a cultural element that also dictates who speaks at the table, how they speak. And so there's a language also that is permitted, and there's a decorum and an etiquette. And so these are all the things that I think make the public sector different. And so psychological safety in those spaces is understanding what are these practices and norms, some written, others unwritten. And as a leader, how do I manage so that I don't offend? How do I understand how to engage and get the most out of the people I'm working with? So when dealing with the Secretary to Cabinet, when we're developing the Zambia Public Service Change Management Framework, when dealing with the permanent secretaries, our team would, even from the way we dressed, were able to step into the dynamic and the culture. Then the way we spoke, the language we used, allowed us to continue and tap into what was the psychological safety norms that are being practiced. And where necessary, where do we want to push the boundaries a bit, where we want to have more voices, but we still want to respect the fact that once the Secretary to Cabinet has spoken, nobody else is going to speak. So you've got to appreciate that dance and those dynamics. And so our language was also different. So creating psychological safety is understanding and reading the room and understanding the people you're addressing and their relationships. I hope that helps. Over.
Thank you very much, Honda. That was a very powerful answer. And I have taken note of some practical steps from that. We have two more questions. Naomi has a question for us, but I'd like to acknowledge our LinkedIn audience because we have a question on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And maybe I feel you've covered aspects of this before, but maybe just very shortly, how is psychological safety affected by a traumatic leader?
Traumatic. Sorry, can you say that again?
Let me rephrase it the way I understand it. How is psychological safety in a team, in an organization, impacted by a leader who is themselves perhaps dealing with some sort of trauma? I know that's fairly broad, but maybe you have an idea for us.
Yeah, I think that is very broad, actually. Whether they're dealing with some type of trauma, I'm just trying to think whether the question meant whether the leader is dealing with some type of trauma or is inflicting something to the team members.
Inflicting?
Yeah, I think maybe the second one was what the question meant. And I think what you mean is maybe they're showing instances of bullying or unfair treatment, which might discourage people from speaking up and which might discourage people from speaking up about their actions. And so the question is how then psychological safety is affected, right? In this scenario, Amadeus?
Yes, correct.
Right. So with leaders whose behaviors themselves don't encourage people to speak up or admit to mistakes, or there's no space for mistakes, essentially. What happens is, like I was discussing previously, it creates an energy of anxiety, and just borrowing from the general psychology literature is like when there is a level of anxiety that helps somebody perform, because anxiety is essentially stress pushing you towards a certain action. And there is some type of hyperfixation with a certain activity. So for example, if I knew that I had to make this presentation. And so there was some level of stress, maybe not stress anxiety, but stress that was upon me to prepare and to make sure that I have the materials ready. And it's another level of anxiety when if my manager, for example, was very strict and said there is no room for any type of mistakes, and this is the standard that we're delivering it. And of course, I understand there's a standard to reach, but if there was no space for mistakes at all, then there's a whole other level of anxiety to what I might have been exhibiting today. And so that then influences someone's performance. So managers who do not make space for mistakes or in their own behaviors actually actively hurting employees, then creates this anxious energy, which is debilitating to the performance of the organizations and the objectives of the team. And so I'd actually encourage somebody like that to reflect very deeply and to have some type of leadership development done so that they can adjust that and be able to address the goals that they need to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Doreen. Doreen, I have a two-part question from Naomi that I feel are very, very insightful. And all these questions are insightful, very interesting. Naomi asks, how, and I think this is relevant to all of us as leaders, how can a leader disclose a mistake to their subordinates or team without undermining their authority? So how can I practice this aspect of psychological safety without necessarily making myself undermining my own authority? That's very tricky.
I think the question itself is very telling, and it speaks to the values that we have in these high context cultures, because I think that wouldn't be the same question in a low context culture environment where leaders are seen as more of peers who have been given. Sorry. Where leaders are seen as more of.
Please put up your hand. Sorry for the story.
Oh, that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll continue. Yeah, so I was saying it speaks to the values that we have, as in there needs to be some type of distance, respect that exists, and that is contingent upon leaders also not seeming like they are incompetent. Because I think what the question is pointing at is that when leaders openly admit these mistakes to their teams, then they risk being seen as incompetent, and they risk the levels of respect that is afforded to them being lowered, because then the perception is that they're incompetent. And so when this is what Nankonde was discussing about, being able to understand when cultural dynamics come into play. So if it's an environment as a leader openly admitting to mistakes, maybe it's frequently admitting to mistakes, might make people undermine your authority, which will then lower the level of influence that you have over them. That is acting against the goals of leadership. Because as a leader, you want to influence people towards a certain action, towards a certain vision, towards completing a certain mission. And so this is one of the cases whereby as a leader, you have to have that intelligence to look at the context, to look at the expectations of people. And whether if the expectation is then that you don't make mistakes, it might not be the best idea to openly discuss and maybe that you can adjust the level of frequency, the amount of times that you openly discuss a mistake that you made. There's still an important balance to be achieved in terms of maintaining humanity, as in making people able to relate to you as a person. And one of that is in admitting to mistakes and helping people understand that you are also just a person who, in making mistakes, also can relate to their mistakes. But also maintaining your position as a leader who is competent, but also has a lot of influence on their followers. So I think then you have to gauge and you have to observe, what are the expectations of the team here? What are the cultural values that are playing up? What are the expectations according to their cultural values? And what does that mean in terms of the behavior that you have to show in that particular time? I hope I've helped answer that question.
I know we're slightly over time, but I would love to one or two more questions just to give everyone a chance there was a really good question posted in the chat that I'd like us to address. But Ngosa, you had unmuted yourself. Do you have a question for us?
My apologies. I think I did not check my settings when I joined. My apologies for disturbing.
Oh, no, no.
I've been listening. I joined slightly late, but I have been listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Fantastic. So the question we have is about how do you deal with a workplace that explicitly implies psychological safety, but mistakes are punished, particularly through public humiliation? That's
thank you. I think it's Naomi who asked this question. Thank you, Naomi, for asking this question. And I think it's the reality in many organizations whereby our values, our missions say one thing, and the actual actions depict another. And this is one. I think this is one of those cases whereby if these public displays of who we are and what we do and what appeals to somebody and they apply to a job and they found the situation very differently, then it's very discouraging. But I think this is one of the places that a cultural overhaul is needed. I think this is a situation that calls for a person, perhaps a consultant, an outsider, somebody with an objective view to come in and look at the day-to-day actions, how leaders behave, what emotions and what emotions and feelings and overall responses that is having, or the leader behavior is having to the employees and to the organization, and then respond with interventions. I think that is a situation that calls for a cultural overhaul for sure, because we can't just say that maybe a training session will help, or just a one-time intervention will help. I think this has to be an intervention that is over time, aiming to actually restructure the way that people think about what is normal and what is accepted, and the culture in general of that place. So that is what I would recommend.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Doreen. We have unfortunately run out of time. We'd like to thank all our participants for your questions, for your attention, for being with us in the Zoom call or on LinkedIn, or for those who will join us later on the YouTube channel. Please follow us there as well, so you'll never miss a session. That being said, if you are looking to partner with an organization for your leadership development assessments and analytics, and you want to deploy them in a psychologically safe way, speak to us. You can find us online at zangametrics.com. You can follow us, of course, on LinkedIn and on our other social platforms. My email is both on the screen and in the chat right now. Please reach out. We will do our best to support you and to assist in any way we can. Doreen, it has been a pleasure as always. I have learned. It feels like a class that is not a class. It has been a pleasure learning from all the colleagues on the call. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for taking the time. We appreciate you. And we really love the questions that you've asked. There's a lot of value in this. And let's continue the conversation. Follow us on LinkedIn. Engage us. Let's continue speaking and learning from each other. We learn as much from you as I do from Doreen. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And the accolades are coming in, Doreen. Well deserved. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. Much love. Have a wonderful day, wherever and whenever you are. And goodbye from the Zanga team for today. God bless. We'll have our next webinar last Thursday of next month. Yes, please, Doreen.
No, I was just saying thank you, and I realized I cut you off before you said when we're having our next webinar.
No, not at all. It's a pleasure. So we want to thank you again. Our next webinar is on the last Thursday of July. Join our mailing list if you're not there already. We always update and share any and all details about that on our mailing list. And like I said, everything will come up on our YouTube channel where you can rewatch it and share it with your network. And we'd really appreciate if you share it. Thank you so much. God bless. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.